Hello everyone, it is me, Louis, aka Duncan Gaming, and today I'm going to be giving you my timeline for the Skarloey Railway. This will be going chronologically from when the Skarloey Railway was first built up until present day. Before I start getting into the timeline, I want to discuss a couple things. Firstly, the years will be placed in one of the top corners to show what year the event takes place. Secondly, this is not a factual timeline, this is not Railway Series exclusive, TV series exclusive. This is not taken as fact as the official timeline. This is my personal AU, headcanon, my personal events of what happened and stuff, because things will be rearranged from the Railway Series ordering, just saying. And lastly, some original stories and concepts of mine will be used in this timeline. So I'm not going to be taking everything that was already set out. I'm going to use a bit of my creativity here as well. So, without further ado, let's get onto the timeline. So, in the early 1800s, copper was found in the mines of Ward Fell. So, a railway line was constructed to Crosley Cairn from Balladwale, run by horses, and this was called the railroad. In 1863, plans were made to build a narrow gauge line from Crovan's Gate to the mountains of Skarloey, so the old railroad was pulled up and construction on the Skarloey Railway began. In 1864, an engine arrived from Whitehaven Works called Skarloey, who was named after one of the future stations of the railway, to help out construction of the railway and make it go by quicker. He was always intended to run the line when it was completed. The railway opened in 1865 and Skarloey handled the passenger trains. It was very popular with tourists and people flocked every year. Because the numbers of passengers increased, it was clear they needed another engine. So, in the year after, 1866, Rheneas was purchased and arrived to help Skarloey on the railway. However, these two engines did not get along. Rheneas would always get fed up of Skarloey bragging about how he was the most important just because he was named after a station, despite the fact Rheneas had the same case. It also didn't help when Skarloey gained a cab in 1867. The two would often argue about things, arguing about which trains they would take, arguing about who was the stronger engine. This is somewhat similar to how they were acting in Rheneas and the Dinosaur and Push Me Pull You, but not to this stupidity, and the other narrow gauge engines were not on the railway yet. When Rheneas rescued Skarloey from a mudslide, they learned to be a bit more respectful to each other and not argue as much. I should also mention the coaches Agnes, Ruth, Lucy, Jemima and Beatrice the brake van also were on the railway in these early years as well. Rails were added to a quarry near Skarloey, which means slate was now a service on the railway. Skarloey hated working at the quarry. He would rather pull passengers. Rheneas, however, liked working at the quarry. He thought it a unique change and tried to get Skarloey to warm up to the quarry more, but just didn't seem to get him to, as Skarloey was a very stubborn engine. Rheneas had clearly seen sense quicker than Skarloey, and for quite a few years had to put up with his annoying attitude. Skarloey being afraid of loud noises like thunderstorms and cranes were things that got on Rheneas' nerves quite often. However, in the early 1900s, Skarloey almost fell off a bridge and refused to cross over it for being too scared. This obviously got on Rheneas' nerves again. But when Rheneas broke down on the bridge, Skarloey had no choice but to help him. This is where Skarloey finally learned to be a bit more sensible and more mature, and be more like his brother Rheneas. As the years went by, both engines got wiser and more experienced, giving advice to others. During the First World War, the railway was closed but reopened in 1918. In the 1920s, a special wagon designed to fit narrow gauge engines on and run on standard gauge tracks was brought to the island for Skarloey to pull trains down from Crovan's Gate to the wharf. At this time, there was no narrow gauge tracks going to the wharf, so Skarloey had to use this special wagon, which weared him out quite quickly considering the fact that the standard gauge trucks were much heavier than the ones on the narrow gauge railway. In the 1930s, Skarloey stopped doing these hauls but had become extremely worn out and tired from doing it. So, another engine the same class as Skarloey was brought to the Skarloey Railway to help out. We don't know the name of this engine. He was painted brown, unlike Skarloey and Rheneas who were painted red, and was most likely intended to just stay for a few years and not be there forever. In the mid-30s, the demand for slate was increasing rapidly, so more slate trains were needed to bring down to Crovan's Gate. This unnamed engine would usually take the slate trains. In 1939, World War II began, and during the war, the 3 engines were painted in black liveries. However, sometime during the war, that unnamed engine was coming home from a slate delivery when he unexpectedly fell off the old iron bridge and drowned in the swamp below, never to be seen again. The 1940s came and both Skarloey and Renes were incredibly worn out, and a lack of parts needed to repair them resulted in 2 diesels coming to the railway during the war to do the work. 1945 was the end of the war, and the 2 diesels left, leaving Skarloey and Renes alone again. They were repainted into their regular red liveries, but both still incredibly worn out. Renes was doing all the work of the railway, and also the slate mines closed. The railway was desperate for more money, so the manager had to increase the ticket prices of the trains. But many people thought this was a rip-off and didn't come, which resulted in less tourists rather than more tourists. Renes had been running the line alone for many years now, and in 1955, he was on his way back home with a train when suddenly his valve gear jammed. However, he managed to get the train home despite this. Many passengers calling him a gallant little engine, and the driver promised him an overhaul soon. After hearing about what happened to the Tallylyn Railway in Wales becoming the first preserved railway in the world, a man called Sir Handel Brown did not want to see the Skarloey Railway go down and wanted to save it. Therefore, he officially took ownership in the year 1956 and sent Renes off to be overhauled. He did, however, close the railway just so he had time to figure out what he wanted to do with it to make sure it would survive. He hired a controller called Peter Sam to control the railway, and ordered 2 more engines, which were recently sold from the Mid-Sodor Railway nearby. These engines were called Stuart and Falcon. He renamed Falcon after himself to Sir Handel, and renamed Stuart after the controller to Peter Sam. The railway officially reopened in 1957, with the new engines Peter Sam and Sir Handel taking the trains. Sir Handel grumbled too much and derailed himself on purpose at the top station. This left Peter Sam running the railway by himself for a couple months. He was excited but often left people behind. One day in 1958, it was market day. Peter Sam was in the works and Sir Handel was the only engine available to take the train. However, he derailed and damaged himself, leaving Skarloey as the only engine available. So Skarloey was steamed up for the first time in about 15 years and managed alright until the journey downhill when he broke a spring, but still got his train home, and the crew was so pleased with him that they sent him to the works for a full overhaul, leaving Sir Handel and Peter Sam to run the railway alone. In 1960, Sir Handel Brown had purchased a small diesel engine from Cornwall called Rusty. He was to do maintenance trains on the railway and keep the track in good condition. As the slate quarry wasn't being used anymore, Sir Handel thought it would be a good idea to get all the remaining slate left cleared out, so sent Sir Handel, Peter Sam and Rusty to do the job. However, on one trip when Sir Handel faked illness, Peter Sam got into a nasty accident which damaged his funnel. With Peter Sam out of commission, Sir Handel had purchased another engine called Duncan. He was from a factory in Scotland, and often used strong language, as they did in the factory. Duncan wasn't the nicest engine, to say the least. He was always grumbling and complaining. Along with Duncan, Sir Handel had also purchased Ada, Jane and Mabel, Gertrude, Beatrice and Cora as a new rolling stock. And Skarloey had returned earlier than expected. He was introduced to all the new faces on the railway and had to rescue Duncan from a tunnel because he was rocking and rolling too much. Later, Duncan kept rocking and rolling, resulting in him derailing and Rusty coming to help him. Duncan had learned to stop being disrespectful to Rusty and diesels in general. Later that year, the BBC was coming to film a documentary on the Skarloey Railway, and all the engines were very excited, except Sir Handel, who tried to get out of it but resulted in him being taken apart for the documentary. Peter Sam had the honour of pulling the train with the cameras. 1963 had started and winter was at its worst. After a bridge had been mended by Mr. Hugh and Rusty, Peter Sam had lost his funnel by an icicle in the tunnel and had to use a drain pipe as a temporary replacement. The other engines found it a great joke, but when his brand new diesel ejector arrived, which helped him puff easier, all the engines wished they had one like it. Sir Handel had kept slipping between the rails too often, so at the works he was fitted with new broader tyres to help him stay on the rails better. The other engines called them steamroller wheels as a joke. Sir Handel eventually found out about George the Steamroller and had a spat with him, to say the least. However, karma got the better of Sir Handel, and when boys teased him about the race he and George had. After foolishly stopping on the viaduct, Skarloey told Duncan about the story of Rheneas and how he got all his passengers home on a rainy day. After hearing this, Duncan's opinions on passengers slightly changes, and soon enough, Rheneas finally comes home with the works, reuniting with Skarloey and meeting all the new engines. After hearing people say bad things about diesels on the mainland, Rheneas was a bit skeptical of Rusty, but after Skarloey telling him he was an incredibly hard worker and very polite, his views quickly changed. In 1965, Skarloey and the railway celebrated their 100th birthday, and the Duke of Sodor came for the event. However, Peter Sam was a bit confused, thinking this was his Duke, and talked to the other engines about it. He told them the story of Grandpa on the old Mid-Sodor Railway. In 1966, Stepney, the Bluebell engine from the Bluebell Railway, was coming to the island of Sodor to visit the Fat Controller's engines. On his way, he made a rest at Crovan's Gate. Rusty was lucky enough to have a conversation with him, and both got along really well. The next year, Coldy from the Coldy-Fell Mountain Railway, after returning from an overhaul, was resting at Crovan's Gate, and managed to meet the Skarloey Railway engines. In 1969, Duke had been rediscovered, overhauled, and sent back to the Skarloey Railway to reunite with Peter Sam and Sir Handel. The other engines were really glad to see Duke for the first time as well, and Peter Sam and Sir Handel were really glad to be reunited with their grandpa. Duke officially became the 7th engine on the Skarloey Railway. He personally requested to the Finn controller Peter Sam to keep his brown livery. In the following year, 1970, the narrow gauge engines were all getting tired because the passengers were confusing them with each other because of their similar red liveries. They asked the Finn controller and Sir Handel Brown if they could be painted in different colours, and they agreed. They got to choose what colours they want. By 1971, all the engines had their own unique livery. These are the liveries they wear in the TV show, and have kept them ever since. In this year, the owner, Sir Handel Brown, retired from being the owner and gave full ownership to Peter Sam, who was the owner and controller of the Skarloey Railway now. It had been quite a few years since the slate quarry at Skarloey had closed, but the Finn controller had discovered a new slate quarry near Rheneas Station and immediately thought of plans for the railway to have an industry there. They salvaged some of the old tracks used to get uphill, which were used on the old iron bridge. However, Skarloey and Rheneas were a bit concerned this could be unsafe for engines to travel up to. But the Finn controller assured them that they would be safe and well maintained. The quarry had finished laying rails in the summer of 1972 and engines were allowed up there. The industry on the Skarloey Railway in this year was booming. Not only were there the passenger trains, maintenance trains, and slate trains needed, there was now a demand for trains of oil and tar tankers due to the construction of roads in the mountains. Road vehicles couldn't get there, so transporting the tar by rail was the best option, and oil so the vehicles could get fuel to get to the quarry. In the later months, some engines were required to take empty trucks of slate to collect broken branches. On one of these trips, Peter Sam accidentally lost his trucks, and they fell off the old iron bridge. Later, when Duncan was teasing Peter Sam about this, Rusty told him the story of the old engine he heard from Skarloey and Rheneas that fell off the bridge many years ago. Duncan didn't believe this, but his crew made a plan to scare Duncan, which worked a bit too well, to say the least. The Fat Controller had proposed an idea to the Finn Controller to build a small quarry near Crovan's Gate of a rock. However, when a boulder came and destroyed their sheds, the quarry was closed. This did not affect the railway that much, as the Finn Controller was making a massive income from all the new industry on the railway. In January of 1973, he put the money into buying a new engine, a small green engine called Louis, who was going to work at the quarry. He had come from the same factory that Duncan used to work in, although Duncan wasn't too happy to see him again. Unlike most engines, Louis preferred pulling goods trains to passengers. He was one of the only engines on the island who didn't like pulling passengers. When Louis first arrived, him, Skarloey, Rheneas and Duncan were working at the slate quarry for a while, and Duncan made a fool of himself by getting his chain tangled in the coupling of the incline, which pulled him up, then broke, and then got sent flying down into a muddy swamp. Later, a bunch of the narrow gauge engines were taking part in a restoration project to restore one of the old lines that had been abandoned for years. There was a grand opening soon after. Later, Duncan made a fool of himself again after losing his whistle. They had to use the organ as a whistle, and until he got a replacement. Duncan was trying to redeem himself after his humiliating experiences by trying to do everyone else's work, but ended up getting in more trouble in the process. After Louis rescued Rheneas on the Old Iron Bridge, Duncan was becoming a bit jealous and wanted to do something heroic as well. He got his chance when Rusty was stuck on the old wooden bridge which was collapsing, and Duncan managed to pull him to safety just in time. Duncan had redeemed himself for now. In 1975, Peter Sam found an old coach, which he then had the idea to convert it into a tea room for the refreshment lady. The refreshment coach was made and is still up on trains today. The following year, Duncan was tasked to bring an elephant statue to the new park station, but got on a bit of a runaway and made a fortunate mistake, to say the least. In 1977, plans were made to clear out an old yard near Crovan's Gate and turn it into a transfer yards for the narrow gauge engines. The restoration had taken a few months and is now known as the transfer yards we see in the hit era. In 1979, the Skarloey Railway had bought a double Fairley engine called Mighty Mac, and the events of what happened on their first day can be seen in the episode Mighty Mac. Also in the same year, Peter Sam found out about Proteus, an old fairy tale, and Duncan got lost in an old mineshaft, but found his way out, and discovered some coal trucks inside. In 1980, the first fin controller retired and a brand new one came in. In 1982, over on the Tallylin Railway, Sir Hayden needed repairs and Sir Handel was going to go to the railway to fill in for a couple of years. Before he left, he accidentally left his guard behind. After Duke had been repaired and Sir Handel went away, Peter Sam got into trouble with some branches. In 1984, Sir Handel returned to the Skarloey Railway after his stay at the Tallylin, and he told the other engines about the incident when he was hit by a branch and had to wear an eye patch. In 1988, Peter Sam left to visit the Tallylin Railway and would stay there for a while. In 1989, the Skarloey Railway got a brand new diesel engine called Fred. However, he was very lazy and didn't want to do work. He was the number 9 engine. After Lou the Quarry engine, Mighty Mac is not numbered. In the same year, an old engine from the Mid-Sodor Railway called Freddy was coming home to reunite with Duke, Sir Handel and Peter Sam. He also met Skarloey and Rheneas for the first time, and all the other engines. He was numbered 10. 1993 was a big year. The Blue Mountain Quarry was established, and some of the engines started working there. However, the railway had purchased 2 engines. One was intended to work at the brand new steamworks that was recently built as well, and the other one was intended to work at the brand new Blue Mountain Quarry. The engines were Victor and Luke. However, Victor was accidentally knocked off the ship by Luke, because he never saw him again. Luke believed Victor got scrapped and was racked with guilt. He told the other fellow narrow gauge engines about it, and they promised to keep it a secret from anyone else. Victor was numbered 11 and Luke was numbered 12, although Luke was hiding in the Blue Mountain Quarry, scared that anyone would find him and tell him about what happened. Victor's restoration was complete in 1994, and a big ceremony was held at the engine sheds, with Mr. Hugh naming Victor. Victor is in place of Ivo Hugh in my timeline. Ivo Hugh does not exist. In 1996, Peter Sam came home and was introduced to all the brand new engines. The other engines made sure that Peter Sam would not tell anyone about Luke's secret as well. Smaller events that happened in the year was Rheneas losing traction on a hill, and Sir Handel accidentally getting himself shut up in the shed due to his own stupidity. In 1997, the quarry at Rheneas Station closed, leaving Louis without a home. However, he got transferred to the Blue Mountain Quarry, which he much enjoyed. He said it was the biggest quarry he had ever seen in his life. This year, Peter Sam also rediscovered the old Proteus statue and it was restored to its former glory. 2001 was a very busy year for the Skarloey Railway. Duncan went off to visit the Tallylin Railway for a few years and he was gone from the railway. The Blue Mountain Quarry was also going to have a big order of slate and needed more help than they could. Just one problem. Louis broke down during this big order, and the quarry just couldn't rely on Luke, who also had to hide away from other engines. So the quarry had no other choice but to bring Skarloey, Rheneas, Sir Handel, Peter Sam and Rusty to work there for a while, until the order was complete. They also hired a Class 08 shunter called Paxton to help the standard gauge trucks at the quarry. Surely things would be normal at the quarry, right? Well, wrong. Blondon Bridge collapsed, Rheneas got damaged because of it, and so did Paxton. Paxton had to go to the diesel works to be repaired. Rheneas was still in working order, however he did not like his scrapes and scratches. Thomas was sent to the quarry to work in Paxton's place until he was repaired. This is when Thomas found out about Luke, and they slowly became friends. But unfortunately, Devious Diesel had overheard about Luke's story. causing the narrow gauge engines to get angry at Thomas. However, it all turned out well in the end. Victor reunited with Luke, Luke found out it was not his fault, and everyone was happy again. These events can be seen in the movie Blue Mountain Mystery. The following year, Ulfstead Castle was reopened and narrow gauge engines were able to go up there and take tourists around the castle. The events of the castle being reopened are seen in King of the Railway. In 2007, Duncan returned to the Skarloey Railway, and in this year, the events of Duncan and the Grumpy Passenger and Duncan the Humbug happened. In 2015, Skarloey and Rheneas celebrated their 150th birthday. In the popular summer season of 2024, Sir Handel met a red car called Car with a double R, and the two machines were racing. Car won by a long shot and Sir Handel was furious afterwards. In 2025, Skarloey and Rheneas will be celebrating their 160th birthday. And that, my friends, is the Skarloey Railway timeline. Of course, stated at the beginning of this video, this is not the factual timeline, this is just my headcanon for the timeline. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I'll see you in the next video.